Mia Zhang was not the sort of person you'd expect to be capable of bending time and space. In fact, she wasn't even the sort of person you'd expect to leave her apartment without a strong cup of coffee in hand. Her life was an ocean of beige. Beige office, beige apartment, beige routine. Every day felt like a rerun of a forgotten show, each moment faded into the next, until one day, Mia woke up in an alternate version of New York, and yes, it was New York, but not the one she knew. Mia's first clue was the subway. In her world, the 6 train was perpetually delayed. But here, it was gleaming, almost futuristic. A massive advertisement hovered above the train platform, broadcasting a smiling woman holding a product Mia had never seen before. She squinted at the digital sign. "Catch the future with Glow Shift," it proclaimed in neon pink. Mia didn't know what Glow Shift was, but she was pretty sure it was the last thing she needed in her life. She stepped aboard the train, feeling uneasy, but chalked it up to lack of sleep. She'd been working too much at the publishing house, trying to get that one article just right for an obscure literary magazine no one read. That, in itself, was a mild existential crisis, but as the train whizzed through tunnels that weren't familiar to her, when did they remodel the tracks, Mia tried to focus. All right, maybe it's just an extended caffeine-induced hallucination, she muttered under her breath. That was until she stepped off the subway and saw something she definitely didn't expect. The Twin Towers were standing tall in the distance, reflecting the morning sun. She froze in place, staring at them like someone had slapped her. This was not her New York. Mia blinked several times, but the skyline didn't change. It was too real to be a dream. She wasn't in her world anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Mia jerked her head back to reality. She pulled it out, expecting some trivial email about work, but instead, there was a message from an unknown number. It read, "Get out of there. You've already changed too much." Mia's heart skipped a beat. She checked her surroundings, but no one was watching. No one except the random woman who was now standing in front of her. "Excuse me," the woman said, smiling unnervingly. She wore a tattered Victorian dress, like she'd walked out of a time machine. "Are you the one who messed with history?" Mia blinked. "What? You're the one, aren't you?" The woman's eyes gleamed with urgency. "You've changed it." Mia shook her head slowly. "I think I've had a bad cup of coffee. Could you point me toward the nearest exit?" But the woman was having none of it. "You've already started, and now the consequences are coming for you." She grabbed Mia's wrist in a vice-like grip. "Hey, Mia started, trying to pull away, but it was like her hand was stuck in quicksand. Panic crept up her throat. "What the hell are you talking about? You're jumping between worlds, altering timelines. You don't even realize it yet." The woman's voice was steady, but her eyes never left Mia's. "But you will." Suddenly, the city around Mia began to swirl. The ground tilted beneath her feet, as if the earth was shifting beneath the weight of the very air. The Victorian woman shouted something, but Mia couldn't hear it over the deafening noise, and before she could process what was happening, her feet lifted from the ground, and everything went black. When Mia opened her eyes again, she wasn't in the city anymore. The first thing she noticed was the smell, like fresh-cut grass and the faint scent of iron. She wasn't sure where she was. But it sure wasn't Manhattan. She sat up quickly, blinking to adjust to the bright, unnatural light that bathed everything in an amber hue. She was in a room, more of a small, simple house with wooden beams across the ceiling. It had the sort of coziness that reminded her of old movies she'd seen as a kid. But there was something unsettling about it. "What the hell just happened?" she muttered, standing and brushing dirt from her pants. The last thing she remembered was the woman pulling her wrist, then, nothing. She looked around. This wasn't the flat she'd rented, that's for sure. The furniture, the wallpaper, even the clothes hanging on a rack by the door looked wrong. Too old-fashioned. As if she'd stepped into the past. "No way," Mia whispered. "No way." She was standing in the middle of an apartment, or at least what she thought was an apartment. But she could feel the walls closing in on her. Her mind was buzzing, trying to make sense of it. She glanced down at her phone and realized something else was off. Her phone. The screen was cracked, as if it had been dropped multiple times, but more strikingly, it was off. Completely powered down. Mia tried the usual button combination to restart it, but it did nothing. She didn't know much about technology, but she did know that if your phone is dead in a world that's not your own, you're in deep trouble. She flung open the door, trying to find her bearings. The world outside was eerily quiet, and the sky was a dull, grayish color, like an overcast sky. Mia looked around and saw buildings she vaguely recognized, but they were wrong. The streetlights were different, the cars on the road too sleek, too futuristic. Okay, Mia said aloud, rubbing her temples. Something really weird is going on. Just then, the door behind her opened again. She turned to see the Victorian woman standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," she said. "But you have a job to do." What job?" Mia asked, taking a step back. The woman smiled, but it wasn't reassuring. "You've altered the timeline. And now you must set it right. Or else." She didn't finish her sentence, but Mia already understood. The weight of those words hit her like a freight train. This was no longer just a random mistake. She had broken something. And she had to fix it. The woman's hand shot out, gripping Mia's wrist again. "You're coming with me. We don't have time." Mia's wrist felt like it was being crushed in the woman's grip as she was pulled along, out into the street. The city, or whatever this world was, looked even stranger up close. She didn't know where she was or what had happened, but every instinct screamed that she needed to get out. She tried to tug her arm free, but the woman's hand was like iron. "Let go." Mia yanked harder, but the woman didn't budge. "You don't understand yet," the woman said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "You've altered everything. Every small choice, every shift in the timeline, has consequences." Mia stopped, nearly tripping over her own feet. The words hit harder than she expected. "I altered something? What the hell are you talking about?" The woman finally let go of Mia's arm and turned, taking a step toward the road where sleek, futuristic cars passed with a soft whir. "Come with me," she said, her gaze piercing, yet strangely sympathetic. "You'll learn soon enough." She paused, then added, "You're a jumper, Mia. You're jumping through dimensions without even realizing the cost." Mia's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Jumping? Alternate dimensions? Was she in some kind of fever dream? It had to be, right? Maybe she'd just fallen asleep at her desk, and none of this was real. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to regain some control. "And what's going on?" The woman glanced over her shoulder, her lips tightening. "I'm someone who's seen the consequences of careless travelers like you. I'm here to make sure you don't unravel the fabric of this reality like so many others have before you." She took a breath, her eyes briefly flicking to the sky as though checking something. "The timelines are fragile, Mia. You don't belong here. But you've already changed things. And now you need to fix them." "Fix them?" Mia's stomach twisted. She didn't even know where to begin. She was standing in a world that wasn't hers, surrounded by things she didn't understand. A sinking feeling settled in her gut. How did I get here? What do I need to fix?" Mia's voice cracked slightly, betraying her nerves. The woman turned toward her, her expression softening for a moment. "You didn't mean to. That's the problem. You don't realize the weight of what you've done. This world," she gestured vaguely to the city around them, "shouldn't exist the way it does. It's been changed by your actions, even if you haven't felt the full effects yet." "Wait, hold on," Mia said, her mind reeling. "I don't even know what you're talking about. I was at work. And then, I don't know. I woke up here. In this place. I'm not doing anything. You did it the moment you stepped into another world. The moment you altered the timeline, Mia. The woman's tone was firm now, no room for argument. And don't tell me it was by accident. I've seen you before, though I shouldn't be able to. You've jumped several times already, leaving traces of your actions all over the multiverse. Mia's mind whirled. What? No. That's not possible. I can't remember ever doing anything like that. The woman gave a small, bitter laugh. Of course not. You've been jumping randomly, unaware of the consequences. But each time you cross into a new world, you change something. A little piece of history shifts. And when you leave, it doesn't go back to the way it was. It keeps spiraling. Mia felt her heart sink. She didn't know what was worse, the fact that she had no idea how she was jumping between worlds, or the idea that she was destroying them in the process. She tried to process the information, but the weight of it was suffocating. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I'm here to make sure you fix it, the woman said. And I'll help you. But you need to understand the stakes. If you don't, the timeline will collapse. Not just here, everywhere. Including your own world. Mia took a step back, feeling like she was suffocating. She was losing control over everything, over her life, over her mind. What the hell does that even mean? It means, the woman said, eyes narrowing, that when you leave one dimension, you leave behind a scar. A scar that, if not healed, will continue to fester. That's what's happening here. You left behind a mark, and now you're the one who has to repair it. Mia's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. The air felt too thick. This woman was telling her she was breaking the world. She tried to steady her breath, but it wasn't working. So, what? You just expect me to fix everything? Like some sort of superhero? The woman's lips twitched. Not exactly. But I will teach you. You won't have a choice. Mia opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? This didn't make any sense. And yet, everything in her gut screamed that it was true. She had done something. She had to have. She had jumped into this world, where the Twin Towers still stood, where things were different, and now everything felt off. Before she could process the next question, the woman grabbed her arm again, much more gently this time. Come with me, she said. I'm going to show you something. They walked through the streets, though Mia couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. There were too many eyes, too many faces that seemed to study her for longer than was comfortable. She kept glancing over her shoulder, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that someone was lurking just out of sight. The streets themselves were clean, the buildings oddly symmetrical, and yet there was an unnatural stillness about it all. As they reached a narrow alley, the woman stopped in front of a door, a nondescript wooden thing, barely noticeable among the rest of the buildings. In here, she said. Mia followed without questioning, though every fiber of her being screamed to run. She didn't understand any of this. She didn't even know if this woman was on her side. But she was in too deep now to back out. Inside the door was a narrow staircase leading to a basement, its low ceiling making the air feel cramped. The woman led Mia down the stairs, past various artifacts, odd, old books stacked haphazardly, glass jars filled with glowing substances, and a strange, jagged mirror that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dimly lit room. It was cluttered with bookshelves and strange devices, but the thing that caught Mia's attention was the center of the room, a large, circular table surrounded by chairs. In the center of the table was an object that looked like a compass, except its needle was spinning wildly, as if it were trying to escape. This is the dimensional anchor, the woman said, tapping the table lightly. It's what keeps everything connected, or it would be if you hadn't broken it. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand what she was looking at, but something about the way the object pulsed made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. You broke it, the woman repeated, her voice low. And now, you're going to fix it. This, she said, gesturing to the compass-like object, is the key to repairing the timeline you've damaged. It will guide you, but only if you're willing to follow its course. Mia swallowed. This was real. This was happening. And she was responsible, but she had no choice now. She had to fix it. Fix whatever she'd done. She took a deep breath, staring down at the compass as it continued to spin, its needle searching, frantic. She didn't know what came next, but whatever it was, Mia understood one thing: her life, her real life, was no longer hers to control. Mia stared at the spinning needle of the dimensional anchor, her pulse racing as it flicked back and forth, twisting in a chaotic dance. It wasn't like any compass she had ever seen. This one didn't point north, it didn't point anywhere. It just spun, erratically, as if it were searching for something it couldn't find. She reached out a hand, hesitant, but the woman's voice stopped her before her fingers touched the surface. You don't control it, the woman warned, her tone sharp. It controls you. Mia pulled her hand back. The words rang in her ears, but the cold, pulsing energy of the anchor still tugged at her, a whisper of a world beyond her reach. The woman watched her carefully, but there was a glimmer of something like regret in her eyes, though Mia wasn't sure what it meant. You're going to have to follow it, the woman continued, softer now. The needle will lead you to the point of change. You've broken a thread in the multiverse, Mia. And now, you have to repair it. But if you fail, Mia didn't want to hear the rest of the sentence. She already understood. If she failed, the threads wouldn't just snap. They'd unravel everything. Her world. Every world. The woman placed a hand on the table, her fingers brushing against the anchor, making it hum louder. Every jump you made, every world you touched, has been another small cut in reality. You'll need to return to each place, and undo what you've done. Each fracture needs to be sealed, otherwise, it'll spread. Mia swallowed, her throat dry. Undo what I've done? How am I supposed to even remember what I did? I barely know what's happening right now. Her voice cracked, a raw edge of frustration slipping through. You will remember, the woman said, her eyes narrowing. The anchor will show you. She stepped back, nodding at the table. You'll see the moments you've touched, the changes you've made. The people you've met, the small decisions. The ones that didn't matter to you but could have destroyed everything here. Mia frowned. Destroyed? What are you talking about? You changed the path of a campaign that shaped politics, an encounter that led to someone's life being saved, and a simple handshake that kept a war from happening, the woman said. Her voice held no judgment, just quiet intensity. Each of these moments, small and insignificant in your eyes, was the thread that kept this dimension from falling apart. And now those threads are frayed. Mia took a step back from the table, feeling the weight of what she was being asked to do settle on her chest like an anchor of its own. Her breath hitched, but she knew she couldn't stop. She had no choice now. The woman stepped toward the anchor. The anchor will lead you through the worlds you've altered, but be warned. The longer you stay in any world, the more you risk blending into it. You may forget who you are, who you were, if you're not careful. Mia's hands shook at her sides, but she nodded. She didn't know what else to do. She didn't want to be someone else, lost in another version of herself. But she was already tangled in this mess. There was no going back. The woman gave a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Good. Let's begin. She reached down, pressing the flat of her palm onto the surface of the table. The compass stilled for a moment, as if gathering its strength, before the needle jerked sharply to the left. The sound of the compass whirring to life echoed through the room. Mia's heart pounded as the world around her started to ripple. The walls of the basement blurred into a whirl of colors, swirling around her. The floor shifted beneath her feet, pulling her forward. She gasped as her body was jerked from one world to the next. Suddenly, everything stopped. She was standing in the middle of a crowded street, but it was wrong. It was the same city she had just left, but everything was off. People walked past her in a haze, their eyes glazed over, unaware of her presence. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. A car drove by, but the design of it was too sleek, too advanced. The streets seemed darker, quieter. The needle of the anchor was in her hand, though she had no memory of taking it. It spun again, this time slowly, deliberately, as if it was pointing her in the right direction. Mia followed its pull, the sense of urgency growing with each step. She rounded a corner, and the moment she did, everything shifted again. This time, the city was completely different. She stood in front of a building that she knew was important. She could feel it. The air was thick with the weight of it. Her hand tightened around the anchor, and the needle spun again, faster this time. There was a flash of light, and suddenly, she was standing in a dusty room, a small library of sorts. The shelves were filled with old books, and there was a desk in the corner piled high with papers. At the desk sat a man who looked oddly familiar. He was hunched over, scribbling something in a notebook. Mia's eyes locked onto him, and a memory flickered, distant but real. She remembered sitting across from him at a cafe, arguing about an article, about a book review. But in this world, they hadn't met like that. In this world, she'd never written the article. He'd never read it. He hadn't even known her name. The needle in her hand jerked sharply to the left, pulling her away from the room, from the man. The world around her seemed to spin again, and in the blur, she realized, this wasn't just a world she'd touched. This was her world, altered. A single decision, a small step she had taken months ago, had led to this. And now, she was here to fix it. Or at least, to try. Her mind raced. How could she even begin to fix something she didn't understand? She hadn't meant to do anything, let alone disrupt the course of history. She hadn't even realized the weight of her actions until now. The needle continued to pull her forward, and she stumbled through another world, another time. The fabric of the dimensions was tearing itself apart as she moved from one place to the next, never fully able to stop, never fully able to catch her breath. Each world she visited felt like another piece of herself was unraveling. She watched the same events play out in different ways, saw how small changes spiraled into bigger ones. The world where the man at the desk had never read her article led to the dissolution of a key political alliance, which then led to the collapse of a global organization, which in turn spiraled into wars, economic collapse, and it was too much. Mia's head pounded, her chest tight with the weight of what she had done. Finally, the anchor stopped. The last world, her original world, loomed in front of her, hazy and indistinct. It was the world she knew, the one she'd left behind when she first stepped into this madness. She was back, but not the same. None of them worked. Mia looked at the people around her, people she'd known, people she'd loved, and people she had barely noticed. She understood now. They were all part of the same web, the same fragile network of choices and consequences. But this world, this version of it, this version of her, was it even real anymore? Her hands trembled as she stared at the anchor in her hand, the final piece of the puzzle. She had no choice now. She had to fix it. She had to reset the timeline. She had to make everything right, even if it meant losing herself, losing everything she knew, everything she was. With one final, desperate breath, Mia reached out to the anchor, letting the needle guide her one last time. The world around her collapsed, the threads of reality snapping into place, and Mia Zhang, who had once been an ordinary woman, disappeared into the storm.